Hello and welcome to the EDRM Global Webinar channel. My name is Mary Mack. I'm the CEO and Chief Legal Technologist for EDRM. Today's webinar is a collaboration with our trusted partner OpenText called Streamline and Save, Smart ESI Collection Strategies for eDiscovery. Our faculty experts are Brian Coleman and Doug Austin. We welcome your questions and feedback in the console. Questions will be answered both during and at the end of the webinar, and the webinar will be available for replay at your convenience for the next quarter, as are all of our EDRM webinars. If you look at the bottom of your console, the On24 platform, we are very, very happy to have made that shift. There's some wonderful engagement tools for you. The question mark is where you actually put in the questions that you'd like to ask. The slides will be available after the webinar's concluded. There's a paperclip for related content, and if you click on it, there's some resources especially for you. The On24 engagement tools descriptions themselves on how to better engage with the platform. You can learn more about OpenText and their services. Check out OpenText Cybersecurity Aviator. It enables a new threat detection approach. And be sure to subscribe to Doug Austin's eDiscovery Today blog. And this week, eDiscovery Day is on December 7th. You can check out all the great virtual and live events there. And live up next on EDRM's webinar channel tomorrow, Harnessing the Power of Advanced Extractions with Mobile Ultra. Speaker bios can be clicked and popped up to learn more about today's faculty, and you can subscribe to EDRM's weekly newsletter. Last but not least, just like Zoom, you've got emojis. So if you'd like to send some love, there are smiley faces and other emojis that you can use at your leisure, and you can also book a meeting with OpenText experts and check out their excellent solutions. And you can follow on the Twitter bird. You can follow OpenText and EDRM on LinkedIn. And that is it for our engagement tools. Now let's go on to our wonderful faculty. So Brian Coleman, he holds the position of Senior Director of Information Security Awareness and Response Advisor. Brian's team's primary objective is to deter, detect, and respond to both unintentional and intentional risks that could impact life, safety, product integrity, colleague productivity, and the protection of sensitive information, thereby safeguarding Pfizer's reputation and supporting its mission to advance medical care and improve patient outcomes. With a professional tenure spanning over 2 decades, Coleman brings a wealth of experience in computer programming, expert court testimony, and leading corporate data collections and investigations worldwide. He has successfully led a global team implement fully automated processes for data protection, alerting, data enrichment, data collection, processing, and delivery of forensically sound evidence to both internal and external stakeholders. His previous roles include serving as a computer forensic examiner for the FBI, and General Dynamics AIS, a supervisory special agent for the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, and a police officer in Baltimore City. My goodness, Brian, welcome. And Doug Austin is the editor-in-chief of EDRM's trusted partner, eDiscovery Today. Doug is an established thought leader in the eDiscovery field with over 30 years experience providing eDiscovery best practices, legal technology consulting, and technical project management services to numerous commercial and governmental clients. Doug has published a daily blog since 2010 and has written numerous articles and white papers. He's received the J.D. Supra Reader's Choice Award as the top eDiscovery author for 2017 and 18, and a J.D. Supra Reader's Choice Award as a top cybersecurity author for 2019. And without further ado, Doug Austin, do you have a program for us?
We do indeed, Mary, and thanks for that introduction, and welcome everybody to the webinar Streamline and Save Smart ESI Collections for Strategies for eDiscovery. I'm very excited to be a part of the team presenting this topic today, which discusses the ESI collection challenges organizations face today and how strategies and automation can help streamline your collection process. And we've got a fun agenda. We're going to start by discussing challenges that organizations face from a data and eDiscovery use case standpoint. Then we'll talk about challenges associated with eDiscovery collection, the benefits of a strategic approach to eDiscovery collection, and how to build and maintain that strategic approach, which Brian and his team have done at Pfizer. Of course, as Mary mentioned, we do welcome questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And look for slides after the webinar, so we'll get those out as well. Of course, any ideas expressed by us here today are our own, not those of our organizations, clients, or partners, and none of what we say should be considered legal advice. It's best practices advice and considerations. In our slide collection, this slide was strategically placed here. See what I did there? So with that in mind, let's get into it. Let's start with something big data. And this chart from Statista shows just how big data's gotten in terms of zettabytes, each of which is equal to 1 trillion gigabytes. Data in the world has grown from 2 zettabytes in 2010 to about 120 zettabytes today. And it's expected to grow more than 50% in another 2 years to 181 zettabytes. So that's over 90 times the amount of data in 15 years. And if you go back to 2005, when the EDRM model was created and there was only half a zettabyte in the world, that's over 1,800 times the amount of data in 20 years. And this estimate's a couple of years old, so it may even be larger than that by the time we get to it. So Brian, when you started at Pfizer about 10 years ago, there was around 9 zettabytes in the world. Now there's about 120 zettabytes. So what types of challenges has big data growth caused for you and your team over that time?
Yeah, look, the amount of data that is out there is unreal. And what I would say is, you know, for each of the new data sources that potentially come into the environment, you know, there's a ton of metadata sitting behind it that is just as equally important as the content itself. So, you know, a lot of the approach that we've taken is when we onboard new data, we try to learn as much as we can about it. And then we try to identify, you know, what purpose would that data serve in any type of collection or investigation? Like, what is the value of the data? And so, you know, that's been really helpful, but it also means you need to pick and choose and be really strategic about the types of data you collect, because, you know, the days of just saying, hey, give me all of Brian's information are gone, because, you know, that is some of it's not even accessible in kind of a corporate environment. And B, when you say that is, you know, I don't think people realize how much data that is until they see, you know, the volume presented either as a bill, you know, from a vendor, or, you know, they want the answers yesterday and that data still is collecting.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, a lot of data, really tough to do custodian level collections anymore, for sure. And of course, it's not just the volume of data, it's a lot of other V words as well, too. So, you know, like variety and velocity and vulnerability and validity and value, and that leads to one C word, which is complexity. And so here's the 2023 Internet Minute infographic created by eDiscovery Today and LTMG that was published earlier this year, which reflects what happens in a typical minute on the internet. So, and that's everything from 241 million emails sent per minute to nearly 19 million text messages sent per minute to Slack messages, Teams chats, photos created with smartphones, and a lot more. And even visits to the ChatGPT site, which reflects the number back in February. So you know that number is pretty out of date by now. And you can find out more about the sources of these stats via the link in the lower right. So this represents examples of the of data types organizations are struggling with every day. And there's always new data types on the horizon to create additional challenges. So Brian, with a variety of data sources and organizations like yours exploding in recent years, how has that complicated data intensive activities like internal and external investigations?
Yeah, look, the variety has, truly, complicated, the what could be considered kind of a straightforward collection, because typically in the cases that we're working, or in some of the scenarios that we have to collect the devices, WhatsApp data resides on the device. Some of the data doesn't even reside on the device, or it's encrypted on the device, so you can't even get access to it, or it's sitting in someone else's server, something that you don't necessarily have the ability to get to. And then a lot of this, a lot of what has happened is they're meant to be collaboration tools, which are great, right? They're great for collaborating and not needing to meet in person and whatnot. But I do think that then creates even more complicated things around, okay, for example, did someone really share the document, or was it just a link to the document? And when you go and collect data, the data that you're expecting to be there isn't there because of, the criteria you chose or whatnot. So I do think there is a lot of upfront work that needs to get done prior to just jumping in and collecting data. And that's really what we've done as a team, is we've built out kind of a triage process that we will meet with folks and understand, what is it that you're looking for, and what are the details of the matter. And then from there, we can kind of formulate a plan of, okay, we can do criteria-driven collections. We're going to need a personal device. So, we're going to have to go reach out and schedule an interview or a collection of a personal device. And then even beyond that, it comes down to a lot of the, is it a corporate owned device? Because, if it's a corporate owned, did they sign and agree to a lot of the restrictions or kind of the terms of use of a device on our network? And those are things that I think traditionally in the past really, I'm not saying they weren't ever thought of, but now it is just part of every conversation. Because the data no longer lives on a hard drive. It's living in someone else's cloud or someone else's application.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the hyperlinks instead of the attached files, and obviously a lot of discussion in our industry right now about hyperlinked files and whether they should be treated as quote unquote modern attachments or not, and what have you. So certainly adds to the challenges for sure. We have a question from the audience. Let me scroll back down to it. When performing custodian and non-custodial collections, are custodian questionnaires still required before a collection? What questionnaire designs are required? It was essential when she was practicing, and she also mentioned legal holds are also essential in almost every case when collecting documents from custodians. Questionnaires need to be predicated on the filed complaint. So thoughts about that question, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, so I believe the custodian questionnaires are being used, and in fact, I know they're being used. So that is one way. And there's an entire kind of legal team that decides, what should be asked in those questionnaires based on, whatever the matter is about. And so those will also help indicate, what types of data sources they need to collect, and are they residing in applications that you might have to think differently about going to collect.
Sure. And that kind of brings up a kind of an interesting question from my thought standpoint is, with a company as big as Pfizer, do you ever have incidences of shadow IT, and would custodian interviews help maybe flesh some of those out? Is that something you all deal with?
Yeah, I mean, so the primary data sources, I wouldn't say it becomes too much of an issue there, but with other types of devices that we may have, we will have to consume that data in a way that then can be presented, right? So it could be logs of something, it could be interactions of other applications that we then will attempt to export some of that data and then create the linkage and work with work with the legal folks or kind of the internal outside counsel to make sure that we can paint, whatever the picture is that we need to uncover.
Sure, makes sense. So, challenge, obviously, data challenges require specific workflows to address. And since they all involve data, it seems like we're seeing eDiscovery workflows being customized to support these different use cases. So you're seeing the EDRM model, which is, got a fresh redesign earlier this year, as you can see there, being applied to not only litigation, but also other data-intensive use cases like investigations, arbitration, data privacy requests like DSARs, incident response and notification of affected individuals after a data breach, and more. Even the process associated with HSR second requests in response to FTC and DOJ concerns about mergers and acquisitions. The top 7 use cases in the list to the right there were all used by more than 40% of 410 respondents in the 2023 State of the Industry report released by eDiscovery Today at the beginning of the year. As you can see by the blue circle in the EDRM model, the first 3 phases of the EDRM after InfoGov, identification, preservation, and collection, are more important than ever to keep eDiscovery workflows streamlined regardless of the use case. So Brian, how much are you finding that workflows for one eDiscovery use case can be adapted to other use cases? Are they fairly similar or quite a bit different?
Yeah, so I think automation in general can be adapted in really any scenario. And the way our team operates right now, automation is key. The reality is without it, we wouldn't be able to kind of handle the volumes that we have. And so, automation of the workflows, we start at the very beginning of identifying all of the types of data that might be related to a person and where does that live. So that's done through network logs, it's done through all kinds of queries to different systems. And then that all gets consolidated into one platform where then we can initiate, other types of automations, right? It could be the collection of email data, of PC data, of just other, file shares or whatnot. And as that automation kicks off, right, the data is being collected in a forensically sound manner using, in 9 times out of 10, vendor provided connectors for those applications so that we know, the forensic evidence is kind of validated and verified at the end. But it's collected, we image it, and then we actually have built out processes that will verify the image and validate the data within the image. So, we try to keep the automation or we try to keep the work that a human does really to a very, very small amount of work, because, the reality is, as a global team, as a global company, we allow the machines to work all day for us, all night for us. And the hope is when we wake up in the morning, the majority of that data is collected. And I will tell you, automation has saved, weeks of time on collections. And, we now typically can collect, about 110 custodians information with, criteria-driven filters and whatnot. We typically can collect those now within 2 days and get them delivered to outside counsel or outside vendors or to the requesters within kind of a 48-hour time frame, which is unheard of. We've never been able to do that in the past.
110 custodians in 2 days. That's pretty impressive, I gotta say. So yeah, that's something else. So certainly it's not that easy for everybody. I mean, if streamlining collection was that easy, we wouldn't need this webinar to talk about how to do it. So
yes,
right. Certainly the challenges associated with eDiscovery collection include a strong potential for errors when custodians perform their own collection, metadata loss when collection methods like dragging and dropping files in Window Explorer aren't forensically sound, increased data security risk that can happen with multiple copies of data, and increased costs downstream because legal professionals have historically collected data broadly not to miss anything. So we'll talk about some of these, and obviously, Brian, you've already talked about pretty large number of potential custodians for eDiscovery collection. How involved are custodians in collection of their own data at this point, given how automated the process is?
Yeah, so the process is automated from the repositories where we can, right? So these are the cloud environments that are constantly on and running in their environments. On a typical, if we need to do a covert collection of a device, then that becomes it's kind of its own challenge because trying to do a covert collection over VPN and whatnot becomes it becomes time consuming. And on the scheduled ones, it become, I don't want to say it's easier, but it's just it's not as challenging as trying to set up alerts when that machine comes online, and then to get connected to it right away before they drop. And you can ensure that during that time frame the PC stays connected. You could even do things to enhance kind of the speed at which the data can be collected, so that it's not taking as long. So cooperation, especially when you're talking mobile devices as well, cooperation is essential. There's very few mobile collections that we can do without the cooperation of a custodian or a target.
Sure, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So, we talked about forensically sound collection earlier, and given your background as a forensic examiner, what advice do you have on how to conduct collections in a forensically sound manner?
Yeah, I know you were joking a little. This has been a very long process for us. We have probably been on this automation journey for easily the last 3 to 4 years, if not longer, right? And that journey changes as new data sources or new repositories are introduced. And so, there are a lot of questions around, is automation as forensically sound as, a manual collection? And what we've done is we've looked at the data, right? And being, in kind of the roles we are, the data is the data. The data doesn't lie. And so, we did comparing, of native extraction to extraction with a tool to extractions with, various scripts or whatnot. And what we found actually is there really is no difference. In some cases, actually, the data, some of the data, the metadata that comes back is greater and more rich on the automation side as you're using APIs to collect things. And so I think, I don't want to come across as everything is automated, because automation has its place, but there are very good reasons to go automate and to still kind of keep the forensic integrity of the data without kind of jeopardizing that part of the case. Moving fast isn't really a great thing if data is being altered. And so, I will say we try to leverage connectors, like if it's working with the Encase platform, using those connectors to collect that data in a repeatable, defensible way each and every time, and only straying away from that when there's kind of an exception to the rule, and it requires us to kind of think outside the box or do something more custom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess really automation doesn't have to be like one whole process from beginning to end. It's really kind of a combination of, I guess, APIs and scripts and things like that, right? It's kind of a weaving together of the processes. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and I will tell you, we started getting really into the automation for your first bullet there of driving down. Oh, I'm sorry, the light just went out in here. Driving down the potential errors, right? And this is, where someone types something and they just accidentally just fat finger it. And, with automation, we've driven down kind of those types of errors. And I do think, a world where it's just straight automation is not the right answer. There has to be human decision somewhere in that process, and making a decision to say, okay, am I going to collect all this data because that's going to take 3 days, or does it make sense to scale back the data collection to a date range or some other kind of criteria based on whatever it is the investigation is about.
Sure. Question from the audience here. I'm going to ask the question, but then I think maybe add a little something to it. Is non-active document collection still difficult collection? Custodian intentional or negligent destruction, deletion, moving of documents. Most federal cases I worked on included 15% of total documents were non-active docs. By non-active, I'm thinking she means inaccessible, perhaps. So thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, look, it's always a concern no matter what when folks might potentially alter documents, move documents, hide documents, and I do think that's where the having visibility into all of that type of activity is important. And as you onboard data sources, one of the things we also onboard is not just the data, right? We also onboard all of the authentication or the activity logs related to that. And so, we're at roughly 60 terabytes a day of activity or network logs that get ingested into our SIM. And so, the availability of that metadata will help us, really identify, is someone doing something that could potentially, bring some risk into the environment or into the matter. And so I think, it's always a concern because people get nervous and people get kind of, they're not sure what they should do, or they may inadvertently delete a document that might have been important. And so I think, being able to show that activity through kind of network logs and whatnot is important. But I do think too, we put a lot of the cloud repositories on, technically kind of a legal hold so that the documents still might reside in the environment, but maybe not just accessible to the user. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, yeah, another question from the audience here. Are you finding issues in terms of forensics when using connectors to systems that have gone through ETL transformations? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, really the thing that I like about using the connector is the connectors really, we will rely on the vendor to support those connectors, right? And so that's kind of the advantage to those connectors is now we're not keeping custom libraries of code and all of these other, other repositories out there of that data. So, if we do run across errors or issues, working very closely with the vendor is important. And then we will try to, until a solution is available, we'll try to think of other ways that we could maybe tackle that issue.
Okay, great. One other kind of question I had from a challenge standpoint. Obviously, one of the biggest concerns people have about a targeted collection approach is the fear of missing important data that might not be there later. So how do you and your team address that concern?
Yeah, so the targeted collections are tricky, and I do think there's probably some guardrails that people can use, and what we've done is having a discussion around, okay, what is kind of the initial time frame of whatever the request is, and then we would maybe do it to present or whatever the ending time frame is. And in those scenarios, you could also look at, let's take Microsoft Teams as an example, right? Like if this was 8 years ago, that we're investigating something for, there's no reason to collect Microsoft Teams, because Microsoft Teams has only been potentially in an environment for the last 2 years or 3 years, right? And so I think there are some really fundamental questions that can be asked at the beginning that can help minimize the risk of missing data. And I think actually, I won't say I think, I know that part of that is, again, like the totality of the data, right? So it's not just relying on what the custodian is telling you they have, but rather, what are all these other systems where we have all of this log data telling us, what are they interacting with? Do they have a USB? And interesting, a funny but not funny story was, we relied a lot on someone telling us that this was their corporate device. And so we collected the device, imaged the device, and we started looking at serial numbers and whatnot. And we realized that this wasn't the actual phone that the colleague was given. And it was a phone that that someone else had turned into them. And so, if you just take it kind of at face value of, hey, here's my phone, we would have never been able to discover that this was this was someone else's phone. So I think it is, you can minimize some of that risk by using other data at your fingertips to identify where that type of data you're looking for might exist.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Why should you perform eDiscovery collection more strategically? Here are a few of the benefits of a strategic collection approach, which, not surprisingly, address the challenges we saw on the previous slide. So, Brian, let's talk about data loss for a moment. How can a strategic approach to eDiscovery collection reduce data loss?
Yeah, so from a data loss perspective, I am a huge fan of keeping data in a forensic format. And so, you won't have loose files sitting out there on a share somewhere. You won't be, where maybe the rights to that share are appropriate or not. But, when you get things into a forensic image and you maybe put protections around that image, right? You can password protect or encrypt the image. It can really help reducing that, because now you don't have, 30 different versions of a document that someone copied from one share and pasting it on another share. But it also will help in the, also in the validation of that data as you bring it forward, right? And so the data loss, it's in a specialized container that, if done appropriate and correctly, will only be accessible by a forensic tool and by those that can or should be having access to it.
Okay. So what about how can the approach lead to greater security of the process and the data?
Oh yeah, this is because now you don't need to give, let's think of my team. I have about 34 analysts that sit under me around the globe. You don't need to give 34 people access to an environment. You can give, a service account access or an API key access. And then now, instead of having to create a password where I can never remember my passwords now with all the complexity things they add in there, but now you can create really complex passwords that just refresh every so often. They're monitored more closely. And so it does create more secure environments, because now you know that this sensitive data is going to be collected from this system by this service account. And when you start to see maybe anomalies in that, it becomes more apparent and obviously something that you would want to take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, we're getting some great questions from the audience. We're going to circle back to some more of those here in a bit. I just want to try to get through some of these points here.
Okay.
Brian, one of the things you mentioned in our prep call was cost savings, and you really kind of blew me away with some of the discussion of that. So, how have you been able to quantify the cost savings associated with your approach to automation?
Yeah, it's always an interesting thing of, do you do it in dollars? Do you do it in hours? And what we have come down to is, the cost really is around, we try to measure it in hours, which ultimately will translate to FTEs, right? And so, just in a quarter, the automation saved us kind of what hours wise would be the equivalent of 6 FTE, right? And so, the costs are obviously human costs, but the other cost that really is kind of where you can't, it's hard to measure, in that the availability of a resource now, a human being, to go do something else while the automation is running, because they just click a button, put in some information, and off goes that collection. Now that person can be more, they can do more important work potentially, and let the machine go do that overnight. They can actually, maybe enjoy the night with their family or whatever. And when they wake up in the morning, that data's sitting there. And I do think the costs, they might go up a little bit, in the sense of, you might need to add some infrastructure to, AWS or something along those lines. But they are nominal compared to what the cost would be for the various resources needed to do those collections.
Sure, no, that makes perfect sense. So we've talked a little bit about the why associated with strategic eDiscovery collection. Let's spend a little more time talking about the how to do it and the how to streamline your eDiscovery workflows overall. So Brian, having a mature approach to collection doesn't happen overnight. So could you talk about how you all got started implementing the approach you have today?
Yeah, it's really, it's a couple areas. One is, I think, working very closely with the vendors we work with, right? With the open text and other vendors where they have connectors available. But I do think, when we first started on the journey, it was kind of, what are the questions that we ask every single time about a custodian, about the data sources they have access to, just the various kind of technical questions that we felt we could answer from the data sources we had available. And honestly, like, the first automation we built was really just telling me, does a person, do they have an admin account, right? And so this was just a summer intern that we had that had a little bit of programming experience and knew how to interact with certain APIs. And then, like, that little query, brought back all this information, and we just kind of started thinking, like, wow, now we can get shares. What shares are assigned to them? What teams are they a part of? What is the volume of their email, right? And just all of these other questions that now, as a request comes in, are literally answered within the first 45 seconds of that ticket being created, without a human being looking at it. And it's all kind of the ancillary information that you would want of, what's their email address, what location are they at, or are they located, what's their business unit, what machines are assigned to them, what mobile devices do they have, what applications are on their mobile devices, which may indicate kind of what you want to go after, right? If you're after WhatsApp and they don't have WhatsApp on their phone, probably not something you need to go after. And so all of this data comes into kind of a single point of view for an analyst. And then that's where a triage call happens. And, I think it is just a little bits of information each time, each month, each week, that then all of a sudden just build this, this this process that can be fully automated. And look, it's with the help of a SOAR platform. It's with the help of the connectors that are provided, and utilizing those APIs or where we can. And then from there, if none of those applications work, we will then go custom, and we'll build a custom script, a Python script, a PowerShell script, something that will interact with the API or mimic human behavior that we can automate it.
Sure. Now, let's talk about the technology components involved in collection. How did you select them or develop them, and how do they fit in the process?
Yeah, so, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, that the tech components, the components for where the data is stored, those were just handed to us, right? There's people that just decide, hey, we are using Microsoft, we are using this platform, that platform. And then it is kind of our job to build out the process of how would we collect the data from there. Fortunately, a lot of the major data sources, a lot of the vendors, the big vendors have connectors built in for those. So it becomes quite easy to really start testing out what that would look like. In certain cases, we would work with the vendor to create a custom connector potentially. And so I think the tech piece really depends on what it is you're potentially using that piece for. And I think everyone will realize there is no silver bullet for every piece of data. And so, if you want modern attachments and threaded email message or threaded Teams messages, you might have to use one tool. And then to do, extraction of email from an archive, another tool. And then if you want, again, mobile devices, right, you'll have to use a separate tool because there is no cloud repository for a lot of that information. And so I think it is, picking the right tool for the task that you're trying to accomplish with that data source, and then being able to validate that it's collecting everything that you're expecting, and also show why you should use that technology over a different technology, because there might be differences in some of the data, the metadata that's brought back. And frankly, kind of to your third bullet there, using the tech, it might actually help in reducing the errors and produce some other metrics for you.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And I know we mentioned briefly you all use NK. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how that fits in, and obviously NCase has been around and evolved over the years. How does that fit into the kind of technology mix?
Yeah, and so it's a technology that we have deployed and use on our PCs, on the endpoints. So we have over 100,000 PCs with the agent on the PC for collections if needed. We use it for collection of some of the M365 data as well, and ultimately, regardless of the tech piece that is used for the collection, the end result of what we try to get into is getting that data into a forensically sound, NCase image, so that then, we know the data is not going to be altered. We know that it's available for, validation, and the data is secure. And so I think, our use of NCase is really, multi-pronged in like the different types of data sources that it can collect, and and automating as much of that as we can with their APIs.
Sure. So you talked about how some of the technology components you're using are facilitating metrics tracking. What else do you do to track the performance of your process and using metrics to improve the process and reduce errors?
Yeah, so metrics are very big, and error tracking is a pet peeve of mine, in that we try to keep automation errors below 10%. And it's what I would love it to be. Right now we're at 16%, which is fine. But we were at 22% or 25% when we first started automation. So we're getting better. And I do think the metrics that you can get from some of this information is, what is time to collection, right? And what's the collection to imaging, and the imaging to processing, and then the processing to getting it up into a review, and then the review tagging, because we have some processes that can auto tag certain terms or certain documents based on certain terms. And so, I think the metrics there will show you, when someone says, hey, they need this data in a week, is it really realistic, right? But then I do think on the flip side of that, the metrics will help you look at where are your largest volume of documents, right? Or what is the largest volume data source that you are collecting? And so, it can then, drive, okay, is there something we can do to improve speed, efficiencies? Maybe it's a process that we aren't automating that now we're starting to see a lot of analysts, querying or performing or doing something that then we will use those metrics to say, okay, we need to find a connector or a script or something that will collect that data for us because it's becoming a more frequent collection for us.
Makes sense. I know we've already talked about security, but what other things, if anything, that you can talk about that you do to make the collection process more secure?
Yeah, so it's, the development of the work is done and it's controlled, in certain repositories. It's not pushed to production right away. So there's, versioning of it, there's commenting of it, and, a lot of times, those scripts can be quite sensitive because they will contain potentially, a key or a secret or something for those connections. And so we will monitor who's using those tools. We will limit who uses those tools, and those tools are only available on certain systems. So it's not like you can just go and install Encase on any laptop that you want. It has to be used on this type of system with this type of account and this type of user from this group. And so I think security is a very big piece of it, because the amount of data that folks with kind of these tools have access to, and it's not just that they have access to one person's email, they have access to everyone in the company's email. And so you need to be able to, I call it watch the watcher a lot of times too, of like being able to show that Brian Coleman is not going in and snooping on someone else, their email or their Teams messages or whatever, without kind of it being tied to a specific request.
Sure. And then finally, that last bullet point, technology is always changing. So what do you do to kind of make sure you're staying up with those changes and keeping the automation flowing?
Yes, Microsoft seems to change every week.
Daily, yeah.
And So we try as best we can. We realize it's almost impossible. But what we do participate in is a lot of very technical meetings with the various key platforms. And so those meetings, we will talk through, what are some new features that are coming out. We will test those features. We also have kind of a consulting team that, as maybe a new application gets put out on the mobile device or something, right? They will make us aware, and then we'll do some testing on our own with those applications. So it is a continuous cycle of, finding a new product or a new service, and then just testing all over again, right? Validating it, just, yeah, I know I sent this. Do I see that in the platform with the associated metadata that's important? And I think that's another key piece that goes really kind of hand in hand with the data. Is a lot of times the vendors are open to feedback on what we would love to see in a certain system. And so I think we're also providing feedback to some of the major suppliers of look, we would love to be able to see this type of data in the metadata so that we can tell what version the document is, or something along those lines. And so, we're always presenting ideas on how to kind of make the data a little bit richer for us as well.
Sure, I can imagine. So we're going to get to questions here in a moment. Before we do, for those who might not be familiar with EnCase, it's a solution that's been around for nearly 20 years, helping organizations streamline the collection, culling, and preservation of data across diverse sources in a single efficient process. EnCase Information Assurance conducts defensible data collection and ensures effective information governance, which helps investigation and eDiscovery teams save time, money, and resources. And here's where you can get more information about EnCase Information Assurance, including a white paper, a product overview, and videos, and more. So these are resources that can help you understand how EnCase can support your collection needs. And by the way, finally, OpenText invites you to join their eDiscovery Thursday user group. The next one is coming up next Thursday, December 14th. If you're interested in attending, you can take a quick snapshot of the QR code on the slide or go to the URL below it to get registered. You don't have to be an EnCase user to join. These sessions are focused on having informal, interactive discussions around use cases, learning best practices, hearing about product updates, and demonstrating features of interest. And next week's discussion will center on addressing the EDRM model from collection to review. So it should be an interesting session. So certainly consider checking that out. So now we're to the question slide, and we do have some questions. So let's get into those. So let's see. Our next question here is, what is percentage of fraud where custodians are directed to perform custodian-directed collections? Sounds like in your case, Brian, there's not a lot of custodian-directed collections being performed, but do you deal with that at all from that standpoint?
Yeah, so typically in my role, we do not do the custodian driven. A lot of my work is through the EnCase agent or other kind of means covertly in the background. So, we have seen it in mobile collections for sure, where people will attempt to remove data or delete data and whatnot from applications that we're interested in. But that's really where I've seen it the most.
Sure. And while I can't say fraud, obviously I've covered a number of eDiscovery cases. We cover about 60 to 70 a year, and we've certainly seen a few where custodian direction collections have gone awry. So certainly feel free to check out eDiscovery today and some of the cases there. I know we've covered a couple recently that involved custodian-directed collections of video or preservation of video that didn't happen, and sanctions happened. So certainly an issue and a problem that exists for companies out there. Great question. The next one here is, let me see, it's a bit long, so let me kind of get it in focus here. How about thinking of the left of the EDRM, enterprises that maintain a BI, business intelligence application, which connect to a data warehouse? The BI application exports data into a data management application, which was ingested into the data warehouse. So based on the fact that data warehouses are becoming extremely popular, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, I will say the first place I would go to is the product owners, right? To talk through what is the art of possible in those scenarios. And it's funny because we will get a lot of potential pushback initially from folks of like, oh, no, you don't need access to this system and whatnot. But, really, where kind of I set our focus on is we work with the SMEs of those platforms to understand and to build out a process by which we could get the data that we need when we need it, without kind of needing to make phone calls and whatnot. So, I think, not knowing specifically kind of maybe the platforms that you're speaking about, the first place I always have approached is going to the product owner or the platform owners and really having a discussion around what is the data that we need out of that platform and how can we get it out in kind of a repeatable, defensible way so that we are ensuring that the data is accurate.
The next question, focusing on AWS, PeopleSoft, and ERP docs. How are those collected these days, if at all? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so AWS is an interesting one. So there's a couple things with AWS, right? So the VDSs themselves become tricky because when they shut down, they can ultimately delete themselves, right? And so now you can't get that snapshot of the system. So those become problematic. The nice thing with some of the AWS environments, at least for us, is we have a lot of logs that tell us a story about certain things and certain activity. And so, there are times where you might not be able to locate a VDS, but hopefully the snapshot hasn't been fully deleted and whatnot, and so you can recover that device. And so, again, some of this comes down to connectors, right? And so there are connectors that work with the AWS environments, whether it's shares up there or collecting the environment or collecting the data from a PC using the connector. And so I think depending on what these platforms are and kind of the volatility of them, that will also drive how you need to go collect the data. And so AWS is a great example of, you need to sometimes act quickly or go work with the AWS team to put in controls that will ensure that VDS or whatever that system is, if it goes offline, is not deleted and that it gets preserved.
Yeah, well, I guess with constant needs of that data, it's not like you can just kind of turn on, lengthy holds and off and so forth. You really kind of need a process that's kind of ongoing, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So the next question involves TIFFing. And so the question is, how do you TIFF AWS and ERP app-based documents, whether that be using Encase, Enterprise, FTK or any other collection tool? I'm kind of thinking the TIFFing is more of a downstream thing, but what are your thoughts about that, Brian?
Yeah, so I will be fully transparent. I don't have experience in the TIFFing of these types of things, but I think what you're getting at is these documents are now taking on a different form than just what we've traditionally seen. And so, we work with the vendor to get things into the format that is suitable for them, right? And so, I do think, again, an advantage to a vendor-driven connector is hopefully like they address some of these issues, right, with the way their tool collects them and produces them, so that it won't become a giant issue down the road.
Sure. Yeah. And don't get me started about TIFFing, because obviously it's still been the popular TIFF/load file format form of production. Craig Ball had a great webinar last week on the EDRM channel about ESI protocols and the disadvantages of TIFF formats versus native formats. So certainly encourage you all to check that out. Great questions, everybody. One last question I'll just throw out at you, Brian, because it's kind of an elephant in the room these days. Any any thoughts about what you guys are doing from an AI standpoint and looking at the AI emerging technologies?
Yeah, yes, it is a very difficult thing to look at, and so I think it's in two spaces, right? There is the use of the AI, right, and being able to capture the data that people are potentially putting into that data, or and actually in most cases preventing, intellectual property or inappropriate use of those applications. So that's one whole beast by itself. But then I will say, like, the use of the AI on kind of the ability to review data, and find data maybe that you haven't been able to find before, is really, really interesting. I will say, I'm kind of an old school analyst. I like to poke through things and do my own kind of investigation. But in some of these cases where you have 100 custodians or more, you just can't do that. That's not a feasible thing to go do. And so we actually are looking at some technology right now on the processing of the data so that we can bubble up, certain types of information. And then on the AI front of how we use it as a company, how we protect the data, from a security perspective, that's been a real challenge in that it's a really powerful tool, and we don't want to limit what people can potentially do with it to improve their work, but also we have all of the privacy regulations that we have to abide by in Europe. And so it's not as easy as just saying we're going to log everything that people put into there, because it's not feasible, and it's not the right thing. So it is a huge challenge. So I guess that's a long-winded answer of saying I agree with you on the challenge, and I'm still not sure how we solve it completely.
Right. Sure. Well, yeah, it's great potential and great risk at the same time. So that seems to be where we stand today. So Brian, thanks for all your insights. Great. I feel like this was almost an hour-long interview, as much as anything. But really appreciate all your great insights. I want to thank all of you in the audience for your great questions today. Certainly, thanks to EDRM for hosting and OpenText for sponsoring the webinar. And I will turn it back over to you, Mary, to close this out.
Thanks, Doug. We too would love to thank our trusted partner OpenText for bringing Brian Coleman and you, Doug Austin, together for this insightful presentation. Our thanks to the EDRM community for your kind attention. If you enjoyed today's presentation, please show Doug and Brian a little bit of love. Check out your resources at the bottom of your console and find some emojis. We'll see you next time on the EDRM Global Webinar channel. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.